Oh, sizwe sihle sikaqamatha abantwana belanga sithi khulane ezobhatyi inyenyisa umbhinqo mayijikeleze ibhekile kudala sinqaniwe. Rhabulani ke nifince kwinkqubo yolutsha echukumisa incakancaga yeengcambu zeentliziyo zenu ii-expressions apha kunqa phambili SABC 1 naku-DTT. Namhlanje ke mbukeli sawuxovula siqonqe ngomba wamalungelo kunye nophuhliso lolwimi lwenkobe. Bathi ke ngelamakhumsha wena Azaria, Indigenous languages. Injalo kanye ngelamarhanurha. Ukuzazi kaloku mbukeli ulwimi lomthonyama osabela ngalo neziduko thuthuthe ngazo kusinxibelelanisa nezithethe amasiko nemilondo ekhaya. Nakubeni kunjalo ke mbukeli kuyaqonda ukuba apha eMzantsi Afrika kukho iilwimi ezingaphuhliswa kwihlabathi liphela. Ayike mandiqhele ndixhome ngixela ixhego lixazulula ingxabakaxaka ezixaka umxhaka. Ndimleke okholo sakalubisi nonkanyezi uMadlongothi ndikunye naye uAzaria wakwakho.
Wazibiza uMadlongothi.
Hayi angqibanga. Ndithi mandiyeke ixesha liqhatshwe yinja.
Hayi ngikubingelele bukeli ngikwamukele kwe-expressions mina igama lami ngoAzaria wakwakhoza. It is great to have you with us. We are coming to you live and direct from Kwayindonga ziyaduma phansi eGoli. Silapha mbukeli sizobungaza kunye nani inyanga yamagugu kanye namasiko. Wonke ke mbukeli umhlaba mhla zingama21 ngenyanga kaNhlolanja umhlaba wonke jikelele ubungaza usuku olwaziwa nge-International Mother Language Day, which was established by inhlangano kaMhlaba uhlangene i-UNESCO mbukeli. Now this day is essential and is an essential platform to promote the importance of cultural and linguistic diversity kholoza. Futhi ke uzwazi ukuthi ezimfundo zidlala indima ebaluleke kakhulu futhi eqhakathekile ukuthi siphuhlise izilimi zethu zomdabu. Ayike mbukeli umdidiyeli wethu compiled this insight for us.
Indigenous people have rightful aspirations for their languages and cultures, supported under the international conventions, laws, policies, and inquiry recommendations. Additionally, the inclusion of indigenous languages in education can impact positively on indigenous students' learning, engagement, identity, well-being, and can increase involvement of their communities in education. But in South Africa, some languages are more developed and universalized than others. With 11 official languages in the country, what could be the causation thereof, and what needs to be done to curb this phenomenon? For expressions on SABC 1, I'm Tseho Fatso Mahulego.
What a beautiful way to start a show mbukeli. Namhlanje mbukeli sibungaza izilwimi zethu zomdabu njengabantu balapha eSouth Africa. And to join me to unpack this discussion right now, I'm joined by Lance Shields, who's the CEO of Penn Lab, and also Dr. Mlamli Diko, who's a lecturer at the University of South Africa. Guys, nginibingelele nginamukele expressions.
Thank you.
Yeah, so, Lance, I just want to start with you. Why is it important for us to promote and preserve our South African indigenous languages?
Firstly, a very good afternoon to you and also your viewers, and thank you for inviting me to Expressions. With no pun intended, language is an expression of the person. It's a means of communication. And more importantly, it's got a very strong orientation towards how heritage is shaped within our country and other countries at large. So I think it's very important because why? Not only, as I said, is it that needs to be preserved, but also to ensure that the children that we have can have the benefit with generations to come in terms of education, in terms of the impact that they have in communicating to get access to socioeconomic resources, and also largely to ensure that we preserve and protect these languages, and a lot of them are in decline in our country. And there's a lot of work that we are doing at this point in time to ensure that we reverse the potential loss and attrition of these key languages.
Okay, Dr. Mlamli, Lance just spoke about the education system and also fundisa abantwana abancane emakhaya about the importance of our indigenous languages. You're a young person. We as young people, especially in this digital age, we tend to pride ourselves in speaking isiNgisi, sikhuluma isilungu. But here you are working very hard to preserve ulwimi lwakini, which is isiXhosa. Why ucabanga ukuthi umsebenzi wakho ubalulekile at this day and age?
Thank you and greetings to the viewers. I must indicate that the challenge began during the apartheid era, in which our indigenous languages were distorted and undervalued, so much that their relevance was erased within the educational sector, in particular within the higher educational context in South Africa. Now, that is problematic, therefore, because what it does, it divorces our languages from the mainstream developments such as technology, artificial intelligence, and diplomatic communication. Now, it is important, therefore, that within the educational context, we reclaim our indigenous languages. As you have indicated, it is regrettable that young people and children are unable to effectively use their ancestral languages. And I am tempted, therefore, to think that the inability for one to express themselves in their indigenous language is, in fact, a humiliation and a mockery of our indigenous languages, which is why, therefore, it is important for us to be uncomfortable when we notice the ways in which our indigenous languages are sidelined.
Yeah. Okay, just speaking of kids, I also just want to jump in because I've seen scenarios where we use English as a measure of intelligence, you know. We would applaud a grade 5 learner who speaks fluent English, but angazazi ithakazelo zakhe. So at this point, who do you think is failing the kids? Is it the education system? Is it abazali ngokwabo, or is it just the society at large?
I think we should blame parents first, especially when they continue to romanticize the use of colonial languages. We cannot entirely blame the education system because, as you may have seen or noted, there are schools and universities that use indigenous languages or teach indigenous languages. Now, the challenge starts at home when these languages are not spoken. You may remember that the writing of indigenous languages is not enough solely. We need to speak these languages.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, parents, and I think we need to admit that we fail our children. Parents do not encourage, or let me say some parents do not encourage their children to speak these languages, even though some of these languages have been integrated or blended into these Model C schools where you normally see languages like English and Afrikaans spoken. But on the other hand, I must indicate that the education system has its own shortcomings as it fails to properly and effectively blend these indigenous languages so much that children or the youth in general is able to speak these languages, comprehend them. Thank you.
All right. Okay, so coming back to you, Mr. Lenz, you know, we know very well that literature is one tool that we can use to preserve our languages. But however, when we go to bookstores and, you know, there are these categories where they have your top 10 selling books and what's not. But usually we never find books that are written in Tshivenda or in Xitsonga or in Zulu in those categories. And what do you think the problem is? Are people not writing enough books in their own languages? Is that the problem?
Yes, thank you for the question. And I think just building on your previous question about the hegemony of English, it continues to be pervasive because there is an underlying belief that a child that exits the schooling system that is fluent in English will be able to achieve better opportunities. So I think it's important that the compacting that we need to do is ensure that parents, and the old idiomatic expression of it takes a village to raise a child, I think communities needs to get involved in ensuring the promotion of mother tongue-based speaking in home, and also to ensure that the education system is then aligned, curriculum developed so that we can work together. We have had a program with isiXhosa where we've introduced it, and the STEM subjects in particular, where it was introduced in teaching. And we found that the students that exited from that program actually did very, very well in comparison to those that were taught in English as a medium of instruction. Coming to the importance of literature with languages, books can only be read if people actually go and purchase it. So I think there's a few things. The first is a desire to ensure that there's reading in our indigenous languages. Secondly, it's the promotion of this as well. I think the private sector have got a very long way to go. And in answering your question also about why is it we're not seeing more publications in the top 10, I think it's got something to do with the extent to which these are promoted, and also the willingness of parents and communities to actually go, and whether it's poetry, whether it's any scientific writing, whether it's fiction or non-fiction, I think all of that will support. And again, it's principles of supply and demand. If we see a greater uptake, I'm sure we're going to see the private sector get much more involved.
Definitely. Ayike mbukeli sethemba ukuthi nawe kukhona okuxoshayo kule ngxoxo esinayo namhlanje. Umbuzo sobuzayo ukuthi ingabe senza okwanele na ukulondoloza izilwimi zethu zomdabu. This is Expressions right here on SABC 1.
Enkosi kakhulu nokuhlala nathi usahleli nathi kaloku apha kwinkqubo ndaba yakho i-Expressions ko-SABC 1 napha ku-DTT. Nqalelo ke siyibeka namhlanje mbukeli sijonge ukuphuhliswa kweelwimi zemveli. Ungaphuhlisi kuphela kodwa sizilondoloze kananjalo. Owona mbuzo siwubuzayo ongagungqiyo apha ekhaya, ingaba mhlawumbe senza kangangoko na uqinisekisa into yokubana siyazikhusela iilwimi zethu apha eMzantsi Afrika. Qiniseka ke mbukeli into yokubana uthatha inxaxheba ube nathi kumakhasi onxibelelwano sikhona kuFacebook napha kuTwitter, igama lenkqubo lithi Expressions_10. Ukuqovula banzi ke lomba apha ke enkqubeni sinaye kaloku yena uTaron Willard, singatsho sithi yi-language fanatic. Sikwanaye kaloku noNjongo Mbangeni, uyena ke uyimbongi kwangunyana kamama uJessica Mbangeni. Masinibulise, sinamkele enkqubeni.
So this is for having us. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Ndiphanze ndakuhleba ke Tyrone. Dathi unansi but ndizawubuya apha kuwe. Njongo ndiyafuna uqala ngawe sivile kwelacala umnumzana lense sisho into kubana you know what, your language, it's how you express yourself, it's who you are. Ndiyafuna uqonda kuwe njengoko uyimbongi and looking at ilwimi zethu zemveli. Xa ujongile ungathi zithathelwe ingqalelo apha eMzantsi Afrika?
Some not sure about certain kakhulu kuba ezikolweni ezininzi asifundiswa languages zethu kakhulu. Indigenous languages are not being restricted, but sifundiswe kulanduke kuzo kuqale ngqo kuzo be deep yonke into sifundiswe even siye phambili kakhulu.
And kulento ithetha into kubana izikolweni zethu azifundiswa kuba kumaxa amaninzi uzafumanisa nawe Tyrone xa uya kweza zikolo ezipha emaphandleni into kubana kufundisa ulwimi lwesilungu neAfrikaans and then isiXhosa sisemva. Ndifuna uqonda kuwe ke ngoku into kubana ufunde isiXhosa uzifumana phi ude wazithutha neziduko kunjalo nje?
Molweni nabantu babukileyo. So ndakhule eQonce, right? So njengoba ndikhula pha ndikhule ndedwa, only child for a while being, abazali bam were like, you know what? Let's move into a townhouse complex. I move asangena pha. Ndafika pha wabekona omnye umama ndimbiza umakazi, and at this point she's basically umakazi wam. And she had 2 kids with at the time. They were 3. Now you could say bendingu 8 or 9. Andisakhumbuli kahle. Wathi ke apha kule ndlu asithetha isiNgesi. Sithetha isiXhosa. You can imagine as a 9-year-old who's never spoken Xhosa before, he's raised in an English-speaking household. Uqomba uthini lo mntu? Oh, even a lento thethayo.
God uzayiqonda.
But kufuneka uyiqonde because you want to be part of the community.
Yeah.
So kwafuneka ke ndifunde isiXhosa, and then from there it wasn't a thing of wanihlalisa phansi wathi okay kuthethwa kanje nanje. It was a thing of ndimamele bathetha njani nam ndirepeat, and then they would fix me whenever I'd make mistakes and stuff like that.
Wayiqonda wayiqiqa nguwe namhlanje.
Kwafuneka ndibe khona bangandihleli.
And then Njongo siyaqonda into kubana imbelukazi ekuzise apha emhlabeni ngumuntu obendwendwele amazwe ewandwendwela nje uyimbongi ubonga ngesiXhosa kuwo wonke lamazwe. Ndiyafuna uqonda into bana yintoni wena othe wayincanca kuba nawe uhamba apha kumzila wakhe waqonda ba nam ndiyafuna ukuncancisa khona sokuba nam ndibe yimbongi. Zeziphi izinto ozincancileyo kwaye uzifunde njani, zikuncedisa njani ingakumbi xa kuzawuziwa kuphuhliso lolwimi?
Endivuya kakhulu uba umama ndifundisile kakhulu, ufundisile into ezininzi not ukubonga nje qha nensimbi ukwenza insimbi undifundisile impahla ebezinxiba ebendifundisa athi jonga masambe iza ndenzele apha izinto bangazithenga abantwini onikhona izandla zakho mazisebenze nangoku andisweli umsebenzi that creates I create my own job ndiyakwazi uzenzela izinto undifundisile kakhulu ndimbulela kakhulu undifundisile uba kubaleka ukufunda incwadi andinika incwadi zemibongo athi funda nawe funda you never know ukuthi uzophelela lapha empilweni.
And usathetha ngalonto kodwa ke bendithanda ukuthi into bana sinazo imvumi nalapha eMzantsi Afrika omakhadzi into enhle ngabo bacula ngolwimi lwabo isiVenda kwaye bakwinqanqa eliphezulu masibambe ngazibini ngexesha lenu siyathemba into kubana xa sesibuya siqela siqonqotha uzasibongela ngayo umbongo sibambe ngazibini mbukele kwangoku masithi qhwisi ibhatala amatyala qiniseka ugungqi usabukele iExpressions.
Siphinde sikwamukele mbukeli usabukele Expressions khona la kunqa phambili SABC 1 Mzansi for sure. Uma ngabe usanda ngena hlala phansi nethezeka. Namuhla mbukeli sikhuluma ngokubaluleka kokulondoloza izilimi zethu zomdabu, and still joining me is Lance Shields, who's the CEO of Penslope, right? Getting it right. And then I also have Dr. Mlamli Digo, who's the lecturer at the University of South Africa. You know, before we went to an ad break, you touched on something very important when it came to the STEM subjects and, you know, the STEM subjects being taught in Xhosa. We understand that, you know, English is always the medium of instructions all the time. But now, do you think that hinders some of the learners to prosper further on in life? Because a learner can be good in engineering, but then they can't understand English very well. A learner can be good in sciences, but then, you know, English is used as a medium of instructions. Do you think that hinders some of the learners from succeeding in life?
Absolutely. So we've got scientific research, specifically where learners switch, is particularly from grade 4 onwards. And cognitive development is quite important as well, because you need to assimilate what you are hearing as the medium of instruction and teaching, and also how you express that then in terms of the type of work that you actually need to deliver as the curriculum requires you, and for you to be at a state of readiness with examinations. And again, building on the example of isiXhosa, we found that when they were offered the medium of instruction in isiXhosa, the results improved quite significantly.
Yeah.
So if we want to see an uptick in particularly the scarce and critical skills that we have lacking in this country, and a lot of them is engineering. Of course, we understand the advent of the fourth industrial revolution. There's a lot of new jobs in the new way of the world of working that requires students to actually be able to be adept at applying the STEM subjects. So it becomes quite important. But with the mother tongue-based bilingual education and the incremental introduction of African languages, which are two pivotal programs by the Department of Basic and Higher Education, I think we can start seeing much better gains, and with students registering to ensure that they get taught in mother tongue education.
Yeah. All right, Dr. Mlamli, you know, I also wanted to speak about identity crisis, because we understand that languages, they go hand in hand with who we are, Tina Singaband. And I want to make a practical example that I've seen, you know, happening, especially on social media, when there is a soccer match. You know, when there's a soccer match, there's a man of the match that gets interviewed afterwards. We have had players that trend because they've spoke apparently broken English. But however, when we watch these interviews, you find which they're interviewing someone from Ivory Coast or Ghana, and there's an interpreter right next to them. Asbahlegi, but when it's our own, a person of ours ongakwazi mhlawumbe ukukhuluma fluently in English, siyamhleka. Do you think maybe probably there's a bit of identity crisis when it comes to us as abantu abamnyama, isizwe semnyama?
Oh, certainly. There is an identity crisis. And I can only pin that on the imperialist mentalities who converted us so much that we make mockery of ourselves. When we see one of our own speaking a broken English, we see the need to laugh at them. But one thing we fail to understand and accept is the reality that English is not our indigenous languages, in particular for black people of the lower class or those who come from underprivileged areas. And now that becomes problematic because it drives the narrative that if you speak English fluently, then you are the one.
Yeah.
And as a result of that, that's why we are struggling with issues where the measure of intelligence, like you indicated earlier, is benchmarked against the use of language.
Yeah.
And in fact, we should be ashamed of that. There are so many, now I'll speak for higher education institutions. There are so many students who come from rural areas who cannot comprehend the English language completely, but they understand what they want to do. For instance, in the case of practical skills, they know how to work and operate here, but then language becomes a barrier, especially the English language. It is used to measure whether or not you can do something. Now, that's where now we are stuck. And we've got all these deeply embedded challenges of language and apartheid today.
Mr. Lenz, we know that not so long ago, sign language was also introduced and it was made part of our official language in South Africa. By that, do you think we are headed the right direction?
Absolutely, and I'm very glad you're touching on that because we're also recognizing sign language during this month and deaf awareness at large. So I was very pleased. It took very many years in order for it to go through due process. There had to be a lot of consultation, as you can imagine, with various stakeholders. And us getting it recognized, I think, is one step. I think the next important body of work is to ensure that the South African Sign Language Charter, which provides a framework for the implementation of sign language to ensure that all of our departments in both the public and the private sector are geared up, that they've got services to make sure that there's support when members of these communities needs to come in for relevant services. And importantly, we're encouraging people that cannot sign to also start taking up sign language classes.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time.
Ngolo hlobo mbukeli sibambe ngazibini sifuna iGPS ezothi jike left. Right about now mbukeli siyayiqola siyayiqonqotha qiqiqonde qaqambe ngoba wena sikushiye nonjongo mbangeni nombongo wakhe. Khosi.
Yakutombuluka ihamba. Lasombuluka ihamba. Oh. Niqhele ukuziqikela ilitshe lembovane namhlanje ninqikele ilitshe lomqwangu nizawukhenketha. We are the ones we've been waiting for. Namhlanje kakena ndinguwina onqawuse. Ndingunjongo zikabawo. Unyana wesikhukukazi. Umaduna umsuthu ujiyana. Ishiba sokushubela abantwana. Yena ethe wathatha inxaxheba ngokuzingca kwamasiko nesithethe nebhongo lamaAfrika. Kwile koluthi hutu ngenxabeko kubela inyaniso nenzondelile ukugcina uzuzu lweAfrika. Oh! Kumbona umna lo ubonayo ngamazwe olwandle ayeluzela na. Hayi! Yipiko kwinteke entle kulizwe liphela yini lamadoda. Hayi! Sidafo dealing the Rocky Valley inyebe eqinqebe lesixhotyeni ngaphakathi kwamalala kusini na. Hayi! Kudu idli kaAfrika lona bayibasile kwaqhuma irhuluwa yarhaxwa idlu kaAfrika. Oh! Madinyeka ufazile ndabo nthakatha. Dega. Dega.